Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Luks here at the Freedom Forum, and I've got my guest from Canada, Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Hi there, Arnie. How are you?
I'm really well, thank you. Today's subject is actually a continuation from last week, and that was the history of the social credit movement. And of course, Wallace has been involved since he was a young lad, as I have been since I was a young lad. But there's a lot of rich history there that hasn't been touched on. At least it's not certainly known in the public domain. And the fact is that, just to recap a little bit on last week, the early 1900s was a significant period where people were considering philosophy. And that is the different paradigms, the different ways of thinking about reality and the world. And that philosophy was presented in a fashion where capitalism, or at least monopoly capitalism, socialism, Marxist socialism, national socialism, Fabian socialism, communism, are all considered, in a sense, collectivist philosophies. And it's only Christianity, and in particular, the outworking of Christianity through the policy called social credit, that is where power is vested in the individual. And I think that's absolutely fascinating that where you've got all these other, if you like, philosophies or dogma presenting power as external and imposed on the individual, Christianity presents it that power is within. The power and authority is within. Wallace Klinck.
That's right, Arnie. It's certainly true. Douglas warned against the dangers of utopian ideas because they contain a preconceived, prepackaged idea of how the world should function. And that requires some mechanism of imposing that particular norm or pattern or model on society. And of course, social credit does not believe in that sort of approach to life at all. We value the individual, and the individual's freedom is really ultimately the most important factor in life. And the question is, how do you achieve that? Now, in these days that you're talking about, there was a lot of activity with regard to monetary reform. You had Professor Soddy, and you had Kitson, and you had Foster and Catchings in the States, and you had many other people who were involved in it. But it wasn't a subject that was in the public awareness. It was a rather exclusive, specialized subject, and the average person just wasn't drawn into it. And being a specialized subject, it wasn't something the average person would readily understand.
Hmm.
And so it was something that was happening. But I will say this, that Douglas was certainly part of that era, but he did develop his ideas independently from these other people, more or less
Hmm.
independently.
Hmm.
He developed them through the progress he made in life and the experiences he had as an engineer and the observations he made, which led him to believe that finance put an unnatural suppression or blockage of the accomplishment of physical things, and being involved in not only engineering but also in accountancy at the Royal Aircraft Works. He literally discovered the source of the problem, that the system simply wasn't generating enough effective purchasing power for the costs of industry to be liquidated in the act of production, as the economists had been wont to say.
That's a.
uh,
I find that fascinating, Wally, because I think here of a paper that I read. I think it was last year, and I believe the introduction was written by a bloke called Bill Daly from Canada, and
mhm.
it was to do with the scientific approach, scientific being inductive or deductive, and if you like, the inductive approach is based on observation, and you make a, if you like, you make a theory or a hypothesis, and then you continue to observe and test that hypothesis, and at such time as the hypothesis fails, then you have to come up with a new one. And so
That's
this
right.
inductive approach is, to me, is a scientific approach, whereas
Mhm.
a deductive approach, and that is that you essentially have a point of view and you impose that point of view over the circumstances, whether it is reality, whether it is truth, whether it is not. And if you like, it's almost like a religious dogma, this approach that it is this and it can't be that. And it's, well, let's observe. No, not interested. And I find that I guess I find it fascinating because my experience, my practical experience in problem solving, has
Hmm.
to be inductive. I get to a certain point of information, I have a stab at it based on that, and if I fix it, good. But if it's still not fixed, then I've got to continue to take input, and until such time as I actually resolve the problem. And I see that approach as the approach that, or the method that Douglas used in order to come to his theorem, his social credit point of view. Wallace.
Yes, that's true. Douglas approached the problem strictly from an investigative approach. He did not make any assumptions. He didn't approach the subject with any presuppositions. He just was trying to discern or to uncover the source of some problems that the plant was having with its accountancy, and in the process, he went from one step to another in making discoveries. Now, deduction may have a value, but you have to make certain that you test all of your assumptions with scientific inquiry. Because if you don't have you may be operating from false assumptions. And
Hmm.
if you make deductions on false assumptions,
Hmm.
you're going to be led astray, obviously.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that, as I agree with you, the scientific approach has its validity, and it definitely is important.
Hmm.
And ultimately, you have to test things by reality,
Hmm.
not by what you think is reality.
That's an interesting comment. What not what you think. In other words, your imagination can say, well, it ought to be that way, and you and the ought in it isn't demonstratable in reality. And so the ought doesn't work. What you've got to do is observe reality and then place your thinking around, well, this is what actually works. I find that fascinating, and I guess in a sense of you have to be humble enough to accept that you don't hold all knowledge. You only have
Absolutely.
a small glimpse of your portion, your part of ship, and that's all you do. And even then, you can be wrong on so many things, and it might take a long time to surface. And that's why we come back to this question of the different, if you like, the philosophies, the ways of thinking of the world, and we're coming from the individual power and authority, or exercised over the individual by some external power. And of course, that
Mhm.
external power has to be another person. It has to be another person. So
A
what?
person or a group of people,
Yeah,
that's correct.
yeah, that's
And
right.
David Rockefeller, I don't know if you know, but he, in his biography, or autobiography, he made it very clear. He said some people claim that people like us, the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and so on, are engaged in some kind of a cabal that are plotting to control the world. And David Rockefeller surprisingly said, if they're making that assumption, it's true, and
Mm,
I am proud of it.
mm, mm,
Now, that shows you the vast difference in philosophy between those who believe in the freedom of the individual and
mm,
those who believe that the freedom of the individual should be compromised or maybe destroyed by the exercise of external authority.
mm. I read a couple of books by Edward Bernays recently,
Oh, mm-hmm,
and in one of them he talks about the, if you like, the ability to sway public opinion,
mm-hmm,
and how there is a science in it. And public relations, I think crystallizing public relations was one of the books. And you have to have a position of, well, I'm actually holding more truth than you are, and therefore I'm entitled to sway your point of view, even if there's compulsion behind it.
that's right.
It really is it's an intriguing point of view where someone holds the upper hand to dominate someone else, and they use science, they use public relations, what would you call it, mind manipulation, all
Hmm.
sorts of things in order to control people. And in the end, when all else fails, they use guns.
That is correct. And it's unfortunate that some people are not willing to give ground to the other person so that they can make their argument and other people can hear it and
Mm,
make up their minds as to what they think of it.
mm,
Some people have to impose their policy. And we've run into this situation here in Alberta just lately because we're coming up shortly to a provincial election.
mhm,
And lo and behold, there's a publisher here in Alberta who has been very active in, activities that would discuss policies that would be quite contrary to what this present socialist government uh, is trying to effect.
mhm,
And now they have actually held some kind of a secret trial and convicted this publishing company. And they are trying to get them legally barred and charged as being involved in illegal activity.
mm,
Now, if they're honest and if they were people of integrity, why would they not come out with some kind of an argument or arguments of their own
mhm,
in order to try and counter? But you see, they're in it to win.
mhm,
And ethics apparently appears to be of little importance.
mm,
Certainly, any ethics that is based upon the right of the individual to
mm.
speak and the other individual to hear.
I noted. We need to get back on subject, but I did note that there's significant arrests with the yellow vests in France, and they have narrowed. Obviously, they've got people on the ground trying to find out where the focal points are, and they've
Mm-hmm.
recently arrested a journalist. They've arrested a journalist and then systematically sentenced the journalist to 6 months imprisonment.
Yeah,
And it's hello, did that bloke even get a trial? Did he? It's just there. So it's arbitrary power exercised by the state, and of course it's doing away with principles of say trial by jury first off, of
yes,
common law that
right.
and when I say the common law, I mean laws that actually have existed since time immemorial, and it is part of your custom, part of your culture. And this, I guess, I'm just going to bring us back onto topic now, Wallace. That this idea of philosophy, of where we guide ourselves, where we actually want to go as a people, the ramifications of it, in my view, place it where all of the monopoly capitalism, the different brands of socialism, whether it's National Socialism or Fabian Socialism or Marxist Socialism or communism, they're all about this type of exercise of power over the individual,
That is
ultimately leading to tyranny. Whereas,
absolutely correct. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Whereas, might I suggest that limited in Australia, it's constitutional. In Canada, limited constitutional monarchy, def certain powers defined by the Constitution, and then, of course, the parliamentary government in the sense that the debates and discussions and voting on decisions is done in Parliament. And I know that a lot of this is being undone on a day-by-day basis because the party system, the decisions are made in their privacy of their private chambers rather than in the Parliament, and so people aren't even aware of how
that's right.
effective their representative is. So it's certainly an undoing. No wonder philosophy is so important. Wallace.
Well, society, Douglas said, is metaphysical. That means to say there's a philosophical basis for society. We don't just run around in a fog, although you might think we do sometimes.
Mm,
But when you have policy, policy follows from philosophy. You
mhm,
can't have a policy unless you have some kind of a metaphysical basis or a philosophic basis for doing a particular thing.
mhm,
And then you have administration under that, which is the carrying out of the policy.
mhm,
But the philosophical basis is absolutely critical because if you don't believe in freedom, then your policies will not support freedom.
mhm,
And it's just that simple.
mm,
If you believe that some people are entitled by virtue of some self proclaimed superior moral, ethical, or intellectual abilities, then you will accede to tyranny.
mm,
If you believe that the individual in himself has a responsibility, you mentioned responsibility.
mm,
Responsibility comes with knowledge, and power comes with knowledge.
mm,
And somehow or another, Douglas wanted to make it possible for the public to develop sanctions which enabled them to ensure that the people that they hire to do their administration actually carry out policies which are beneficial to the public.
mhm,
Now, our history in the common law and so on goes back. It's a Christian background. The common law means sort of the people's law in a sense because it's a matter of precedent over time, learning over time
mhm,
how to effect just measures. And by precedent, the law is built up over time. And so the court will refer back to previous judgments.
mhm,
And it gives a stability, a predictability to the law. Whereas if you have arbitrary law, the politician can just say today, well, this is the way it is today, and if you don't like it, well, that's just too bad. But we
mhm,
have the power, and we're going to do it.
mm,
And you see that you're right. We're moving more and more into an era of arbitrary state power, where
mm,
the politicians assume that they are not restrained by constitutions or by proper law.
mhm,
And that means that the individual is just a sitting duck for tyranny.
mm,
Any individual can be destroyed at any time
mhm,
if the powers that be wish to do so.
mm.
And you have no
I might
recourse.
just remind our viewers that when we talk about politicians, behind the politicians or actually controlling the politicians are two groups of people which are paramount in your thinking. The first group is the bureaucracy, and that is I call them public servants who are behind them, and they're actually designing, they're actually placing into the very acts of Parliament the ability for these laws to be arbitrary and decision by decision by the minister. And the second group of people, ultimately, behind them and over and above them, is actually the money power. And the money power, all the ministers, all the public servants go cap in hand to the money power so that the actual goings on of the economy can continue. And this has been so for at least 400 years since the establishment of the central bank, Bank of England. And so it really is, when you think about philosophy and you think about, well, where are we heading philosophically? We're heading towards, in my view, a combination of monopoly capitalism and Marxist socialism. Ultimately, both of these lead to what you would refer to as communism, which is
That's right.
the oligarchs are in charge, and the rest of the nations and the cross continents are all just slaves to the oligarchs, and that's
That's
the
right.
that's the actual outworking.
As a
Whereas,
young, yeah,
sorry,
as a young Russian said to me once, she was shaking his head, and I said, "Why are you shaking your head?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "We work, but nothing seems to happen.
mm,
The
mm,
system is not really established to make things better for people. It's to make things better for those who hold the reins of power."
mm, mm. That's right. That's how I see it. That's certainly how I see it. And coming back to the gist of this forum,
Yes.
the history of the social credit movement. These issues were discussed on a day by day basis, all throughout, all throughout, if you like, the Western world, looking at what was actually going on, what was not going on, and why philosophy is so important. Wallace.
Yes. A lot of these, most probably, of these monetary students or reformers that I referred to were tended to be under consumptionists. And some people have referred to social credit as under consumptionist because social credit has put forward the thesis that there is insufficient income distributed by industry for the product to be bought.
Hmm.
And that is true. But the thing of it is, this requires us to engage in a whole new series of production to earn incomes to go back and buy what has been produced before. So,
Previously.
in fact, social credit is, in a sense, an overconsumptionist um, philosophy or approach because it actually recognizes that, in its critical aspect, it recognizes that the present system actually requires us to engage in an untold amount of wasteful activity, destructive activity. We ruined Europe twice in the last century. That was consumption. It was
Mm-hmm.
destruction.
Mm,
So it's wrong to brand social credit as an underconsumptionist idea.
mm,
Social credit should be better looked at as a balanced approach
mm.
to the situation.
I think that's uh, I think that's fascinating, Wallace. I read an article, I think it was last week, by at least the writer presented themselves as female, and it was in discussion about either guaranteed jobs or a basic income for the homekeeper, for the person who stayed at home, and that way it's secured family and that sort of thing. And I thought both were wrong. There really
Yeah,
was no choice because the guaranteed jobs means that if the machines are doing it too well, we'll turn the machines off and give everyone a shovel.
that's
And
right.
and the other one is, of course, the basic income says, well, people need to stay home. Fine. How are you going to finance it? You have to tax someone else. And the fact is that neither of these two proposals deal with the issue at hand. And the issue at
Mm,
hand is the chronic shortage of purchasing power to actually buy what we have already made.
that's
Chronic
right.
shortage of purchasing power. All of the goods are on the shelf, but we have to go and work in order to buy the goods that are on the shelf. The equilibrium that social credit proposes is that there is sufficient money in the hand of the consumer so that as the goods are placed on the shelves for sale, there's sufficient money in the hands of the consumer to liquidate the cost and buy what's there. They don't have to go out to work to earn more money to buy what's already there. And that to me is the marvelous revelation of what Douglas saw.
Yes, that is true, Arnie. It's actually a case of the consumer assuming control of production policy. Because today, if you have to go out and get a job, that policy has already been predetermined for you, and you have to serve it.
Mm,
And you see, that's what Douglas meant when he spoke about economic democracy.
mm,
The communist or the left element would say that economic democracy is where everybody is guaranteed a job and everybody is guaranteed to participate in the decisions with regard to production and all that sort of thing. It's a totally different concept. The basic concept is this, that social credit regards everyone as having an inheritance, not whereas the other side, which embraces all of those things you mentioned, from capitalism, finance capitalism,
mm-hmm,
through the whole gamut, they assume that you must obtain your income through work.
mm-hmm,
But if machines and technology are doing the work, what is the point? Unless you assume that there is absolutely no end to human desires. Well, that is absurd.
mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people would find it virtually impossible to bear the responsibility of administering an unlimited amount of property and so on.
Mm.
It's
I,
just simply
I,
not.
I can tell you now at my age, Wally, I stepped out of the workforce at 58 to
Mhm.
pursue what we're doing here. And and I can tell you that what I have is plenty, and it keeps me busy, and sometimes it's quite annoying. And to turn around and say, well, okay, I'll work towards owning my neighbour's house and my other neighbour's house and this block here and that block there, and instead of having one car, I'll have two or I'll have five. And I'm thinking that's just you're making the wheel go round while you're on the treadmill. It's crazy. Why would you do it when you can only consume one meal at a time?
That's
And
right. We're limited in our physical constitution. We cannot eat more than just so much. If
and
we
and
do, we
and
suffer the
that's
penalty.
right. We suffer the penalty, and the point is that the one meal at a time, even if you gorge yourself with the one meal, you actually giving yourself the probability of having a reduced life
That's
simply
right.
by
And,
being simply by burdening your body with more than it needs. Yeah.
yeah, and it's probably the consequence of a mental or psychological illness in itself, because it's not natural or normal to want to go beyond your normal or natural limits.
mm,
And so, some people, they'll eat themselves to death because maybe they're lonesome, maybe they're sad, unhappy, maybe they're unfulfilled in some
mhm,
way.
mhm.
It's not a normal situation to want to just consume and consume and consume.
No, and
It's
I will note I mentioned earlier Edward Bernays and a crystallizing public opinion, and of course marketing, advertising and marketing, and if you like compulsive buying are a direct result of these working hand in hand. That nowadays using social media and smart meters, they're actually not only monitoring um, what the actual consumption is, but the
Mhm.
effect of advertising. And there's feedback mechanisms in advertising now, as there are feedback mechanisms in politics, if you like. And so they actually, if there's a campaign, they're actually constantly monitoring social media to see if the campaign is effective, and if it's not, adjust it. And I find that fascinating. This is just simply to consume or to alter public opinion. It's just in this constant state of flux that,
You see, the thing of it is,
yeah,
the system is constructed so that we have to keep expanding, expanding, expanding to meet prior financial costs. Because if
mm,
we don't meet them, we go bankrupt. And if we
mm,
go bankrupt, the whole system collapses.
mm,
The producing system and the
mm,
consumer doesn't get what he's entitled to get by virtue of our actual productive capacity.
mm,
So, and that again, it comes back to this idea of inheritance. If you have no inheritance, um, then you have to work and you
mm,
have to work. And if you're working, if you're on a treadmill and every time you do work, the situation is designed so that prices actually advance beyond what you're being paid,
mm,
there's no end to it. You're driven endlessly. It's a system that's very unhealthy. It is evil because it is
mm,
driving people to beyond all reasonable limits of behavior.
mm.
And you see, the thing of it is, we can't say, well, we've got enough now. Let's just slow down and take a rest, maybe take a holiday.
That's right.
You can't do that
No,
because if
because
you do that,
yeah,
you face financial ruin.
that's right. The bills are still coming in, and the food still needs to be placed on the table, and so you're continuing to actually step out of your comfort zone, whereas let the young, let the machines, let them do it. As long as you've got sufficient on your table and the bills are paid, well then that's enough. And the fact is that the financial system could easily be adjusted to accommodate this. But
Absolutely.
the mindset that has to change, and that is that the purpose of the financial system, along with every other system, is to serve the individual, not the individual be a slave to the system. And I believe that was laid out quite clearly in the New Testament.
It certainly was. That's true. And because the New Testament is actually at such odds with the way we do things today, because we're motivated by um, a moral imperative
Mm,
that it's wrong to receive anything unless you work for it. Well,
mm,
if you look at nature, does a lion spend its whole time looking for prey? It may look for prey until it's satisfied, but when it's satisfied, it's one a rather lazy animal.
mhm, mm,
I mean, nature
mm,
doesn't work that way. But
mm,
we've extracted ourselves from nature by this artificial system of finance, which has been designed as a means of controlling us. In other words, we're made slaves. We're slaves to work and we're slaves to finance.
mm.
As finance being above all of it, of course.
That's
And we're
right.
willing, we're willing slaves because we've accepted this idea that, oh gosh, it's really, really immoral of me to expect to enjoy life unless I go out and do something to earn it.
That's
Well, you know,
fascinating. That's fascinating, Wally. I'm going to pull us up in a minute because we're nearly half hour. But
mhm,
the point here is the cultural inheritance, and that is that when Stevenson developed the rocket, when he developed the steam locomotive, and he placed that energy so that they could actually transport, it undid enormous amounts of work that the horses used to do, men and horses and
mhm,
drays. And when you start looking at the steam energy used to drive turbines, which drive alternators, which give us electrical energy, and it's the degree of sophistication that's continued on. These are the seeds of the cultural inheritance to the point now where we have nuclear energy, we have hydrocarbon energy, we have solar energy, we have all these forms of energy and technology to produce the goods. Therefore, we don't have to go out in the field. What we need to look at is we need to look and say, well, if that is our inheritance, then we need to put our hand up and claim it. And the fact is, the financial system refuses to let us have it because they've got hold of it for themselves.
That raises an interesting question, Arnie, doesn't it? If we've released the horses from endless toil,
Hmm.
can't we do the same for ourselves?
Exactly right. That's exactly right. That's that to me is the whole point of this discussion, and that's why philosophy is so important, and that's why in my view, we've got to actually look at this thing called Christianity. We call it in this forum we call it social credit, but
Yeah,
it's an undiscussed subject. Wally.
it is an inconceivable conceit on the part of man to say that we produce everything.
Hmm.
In the first place, nature produces so much, and the devices that we have discovered in the past, the knowledge, the technique, and all of those things has been an accumulating thing, which you can't say belongs to anyone. It belongs to everyone. I can't say that the knowledge of language belongs only to a specific people
Hmm.
who are teaching language or something like that. Language
Hmm.
belongs to us all.
That's right.
And so there's so much that we do really get from nature and from God or from providence or however you want to put it,
Hmm.
that has nothing to do with human labor. But
Hmm.
we blocked up the system. We have bound up the system so that the delivery of that enormous real wealth and the leisure and the intellectual and spiritual wealth that goes with that
Hmm.
has been denied us. And it is not just simply a static thing, it's a worsening situation.
Hmm.
And when you project it in the future, it is really quite frightening.
Hmm. Hmm. Beautiful. Thank you, Wally. That's a good summary for today. And it's been interesting discussing the history of the social credit movement, the early 1900s, when these points of philosophy were discussed in depth to look at the ramifications and the outworking of them. And I'm certainly enjoying this forum, and I appreciate your time. Wallace Klinck from Canada.
Thank you, Arnie.
No worries, my
Delight to
pleasure.
be with you.
No worries, my pleasure. And thanks, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Luks, Freedom Forum. Thanks for joining.